Drive through enough American suburbs and a pattern starts to appear. Detached houses, front lawns, driveways, curving residential streets. Homes different enough to belong to different families, but similar enough to look as though somebody planned the whole neighborhood at once. And in many cases, somebody did. But Levittown did not invent the American suburb. Suburbs existed long before William Levitt. What Levittown helped demonstrate was something different: how to turn one particular kind of suburb into a product. Standardized, repeatable, financeable, and buildable at a scale that could transform thousands of acres in just a few years. The houses did not roll down a factory conveyor. The workers moved instead. One crew performed one operation, then moved to the next lot. Another crew followed, then another. House after house, street after street. But here's the harder question. If you can make suburban homeownership easier to produce, easier to finance, and easier to sell by the thousands, who gets to become the customer? Because the same system that helped make a detached house attainable for thousands of postwar families also came with rules about who could enter the neighborhood. So this is not the story of how Levittown invented suburbia. It is the story of how one Long Island development helped make a mass-produced suburban model feel normal, and what happened when the neighborhood itself became part of the product. If you want more stories about the systems hidden inside ordinary American life, subscribe to How America Became. Every episode explains how one America became another, and how we still live with the consequences. The story starts with a shortage. By the end of World War II, millions of American servicemen were coming home. Many were marrying, starting families, looking for jobs, and looking for somewhere to live. But years of depression followed by wartime limits on civilian construction had left housing supply badly strained. Families doubled up with relatives. Veterans lived in apartments, temporary housing, trailers, converted structures, wherever space could be found. America did not need somebody to invent the idea of living outside the city. It needed builders who could produce enormous numbers of houses fast enough, cheaply enough, and predictably enough to meet postwar demand. That is where Levitt Sons enters the story. The Levitts were not starting from zero. The family had built houses before the war, and builders around America were already experimenting with standardization, prefabrication, large developments, and more industrial ways of producing homes. So the innovation was not one miraculous invention by one man. It was the way Levitt and Sons combined several ideas into one unusually large and coordinated system. Land, design, materials, labor, construction, sales, financing, community planning. And on the Hempstead Plains of Long Island, the company had enough land to see what that system could do at extraordinary scale. The innovation wasn't a moving house. It was a moving workforce. A traditional house could behave almost like a separate craft project. Different workers arrived at different times. Materials were organized for a particular job. One house could develop its own schedule, delays, improvisations, and problems. Levitt attacked that variability. Construction was divided into roughly 26 specialized operations. One crew might perform the same task again and again as it moved from lot to lot. Foundations, framing, roofing, plumbing, painting, landscaping. The product stayed in place. The labor moved. Repetition made workers faster at narrow jobs. Standardized designs reduced decisions. Materials could be purchased and delivered in volume. Instead of asking how to build one house efficiently, the company could ask how to keep an entire field of houses moving through the same sequence. It was less like constructing thousands of unrelated homes and more like managing a production system spread across acres of land. The houses themselves fit that system. Early Levitt homes were small. Design choices were limited. Dimensions and components could be repeated. A buyer was not commissioning a unique architectural statement. The attraction was different. A new house, a yard, modern appliances, space for a young family, and a price that could compete with renting. Levitt planned about 2,000 houses. In the first few weeks, more than 8,000 families had to be turned away. That changed the scale of the problem immediately. On October 1st, 1947, the first 300 families moved into what was still called island trees. But demand was already overwhelming the original plan. Levitt and Sons bought more surrounding land. The development expanded. More houses meant more streets, more materials, more crews, more buyers. The problem was no longer whether Americans wanted the product. It was whether the machine could scale quickly enough to meet them. By the time Long Island, Levittown was complete in 1951, more than 17,000 houses had been constructed. But building 17,000 houses does not explain how 17,000 families can buy them. That required another system. The mortgage system helped create the customer. Levitt's production system created the product. Veterans returned from the war with housing benefits available through the GI Bill. Federal mortgage programs also helped normalize long-term financing and lower barriers to ownership for qualifying buyers. That environment mattered enormously. Levitt could attack the cost of producing the house. Mortgage finance could reduce the amount of money a qualifying family needed immediately to obtain it. By 1949, one Levitt ranch house was being offered for about $7,990. For the families who qualified, a detached house with a yard could suddenly compete with continuing to rent. But affordability and access were not the same thing. In 1950, a Black Army veteran drove to Levittown looking for the same suburban opportunity thousands of other veterans were chasing. His name was Eugene Burnett. Burnett had served in the United States Army. After the war, he and an Army friend drove from the Bronx to Long Island to see the new houses. Burnett wanted to buy. Levitt and Sons would not sell him one. Mass production answered how quickly Levitt could build houses. Mortgage finance helped answer how many families might afford them. Neither answered who the company was willing to accept as a customer. Levittown's early agreements contained racial restrictions. And even as the legal environment began changing, company policy continued excluding black buyers. The production machine could standardize the house. The sales rules could help standardize the customer. This did not begin with Levitt. American housing discrimination was older and much larger than one developer. Federal policy, local government, lenders, real estate institutions, private developers, neighborhood practices, and restrictive covenants all contributed to segregated housing markets. But Levittown shows how those broader patterns could become embedded inside a new mass-market housing system, and the rules did begin to face legal limits. In 1948, the Supreme Court ruled that courts could not enforce racial restrictive covenants. Under pressure from the Federal Housing Administration, Levitt removed the explicit racial clause from its leases. Contemporary legal records show that the company nevertheless continued its exclusionary policy in practice. The larger legal barrier would eventually move again. In 1968, the Fair Housing Act prohibited racial discrimination in most housing sales and rentals. The law changed. But families who had been denied entry during the Great Postwar expansion could not simply go backward in time and purchase the same houses at the same moment as families who had been admitted. That is why exclusion belongs in this story. Not because it was the whole machine, because it was one of the settings on the machine. And the machine was producing more than houses. Levitt was selling a package of daily life, a detached home, a lawn, residential streets, schools, recreation, shopping, distance from the central city, a community built around expectations of what ordinary family life should look like. A house could be standardized. A street could be standardized. Eventually, expectations could become standardized too. Where should children play? Where should the car sit? How much private outdoor space should a family have? What should success look like from the curb? Levittown offered one highly visible answer. But there is a historical trap here. It would be easy to look at Levittown's fame and conclude that America simply copied William Levitt. It didn't. Levittown was famous, but it wasn't alone. By 1949, builders producing at least 25 houses a year represented only about 4% of American home builders. Yet that small group was responsible for roughly 45% of residential construction. Before the war, only about 100 builders nationwide had produced at least 100 homes in a year. By 1949, around 720 did. Something much larger than Levittown was happening. Outside Chicago, Park Forest was becoming another major planned post-war community. In California, large developers were creating subdivisions on enormous scales of their own. Panorama City began with more than 1,500 houses. Joseph Eichler developed his own distinctive version of California tract housing. Lakewood would add more than 17,000 homes near Los Angeles. Different builders, different architecture, different regions, but similar economic logic. Acquire land at scale, reduce unnecessary variation, organize construction for volume. Build for anticipated buyers rather than waiting for one commissioned client at a time. Coordinate roads, utilities, marketing, financing, and construction. Sell the house and the suburban lifestyle together. America was not copying one townhouse for house. The American home building industry itself was changing, and Levittown became one of the clearest demonstrations of just how far that new system could go. That distinction makes Levitt historically more interesting, not less. If William Levitt had single-handedly invented suburbia, this would mostly be a biography. Instead, Levittown lets us watch a national transformation operating in unusually visible form. Levitt Sons carried its own system beyond Long Island. Another Levittown rose in Pennsylvania. Later projects followed elsewhere. But other merchant builders were solving similar problems at the same time. By the end of the 1950s, roughly 1% of American builders were producing about 1/3 of the nation's new houses. The craft builder had not disappeared. Custom housing had not disappeared. Older suburbs had not disappeared. But the economics of American home building had changed. Large-scale tract development had become a powerful way to expand metropolitan America. And when a method works long enough, it stops looking like a method. It starts looking like ordinary American life. That may be Levittown's most important legacy. Not one exact Cape Cod house, not one floor plan, not one Long Island street. The deeper legacy is the normalization of the idea that large pieces of metropolitan America could be created as coordinated residential products. A developer could acquire a tract, lay out streets, offer a limited family of houses, repeat construction, market the community, connect buyers with financing, package ownership with schools, shopping, roads, recreation, yards, and automobiles. Then another builder could do something similar somewhere else. Over time, the extraordinary starts to disappear. The curved streets look normal. The driveways look normal. The repeated setbacks look normal. The detached house with a lawn looks normal. The subdivision itself stops looking manufactured. It simply looks American. For millions of families, that system created a real opportunity. A private house, more space, a yard, a neighborhood that felt new, an asset that could be owned instead of rented. For families admitted into that market early, suburban ownership could become part of long-term economic security. For families excluded from it, the opportunity arrived differently or later. The production breakthrough was real. The affordability breakthrough was real. The exclusion was real too. Those facts do not cancel one another. They are parts of the same transformation. If this story changed how you see the suburban street, hit like, share it with someone who grew up in a neighborhood like this, and tell me in the comments which part of the system mattered most, how the houses were built, how families financed them, or the rules determining who could enter the community. Because Levittown did not invent suburbia, and America did not simply copy Levittown. What happened was larger than either claim. Across post-war America, builders, lenders, government programs, consumers, and developers were creating a new housing system. Levittown became one of its clearest demonstrations. It showed what could happen when large-scale land development, standardized design, specialized labor, Volume purchasing, mortgage finance, and mass marketing were synchronized around one objective: to produce an entire suburban community at scale. Before that transformation, American suburbs already existed. After it, the mass-produced subdivision became one of the dominant ways metropolitan America expanded. And access to that new normal was never distributed evenly. The house became repeatable. The neighborhood became scalable. The buyer could increasingly finance the product over decades, and the rules surrounding that product helped determine who entered first. That is why Levittown still matters. Not because William Levitt invented the American suburb, but because Levittown helped show how a particular version of suburban life could be manufactured so efficiently, sold so successfully, and reproduced on such a scale that eventually the system itself became almost invisible. What once looked like an industrial experiment on a Long Island potato field came to look like an ordinary American street. And that is how a manufactured suburban model became part of the American normal.